Anyway, with that, I appreciate you all joining us for the fourth and final NASEO Wildfire Forum webinar as part of our series. This one's going to be focused on legislation and policy diffusion. So for folks that might be new to these wildfire forums, just a quick briefer. We really aim to have these forums for state energy offices and the broader SLTT community, really just to have get you all prepared for the mitigation and response to wildfires. This really is intended to be an entire information push, but really want this to serve as like a reliable and beneficial environment for, again, some honest conversations, questions, and earnest conversations. And our hope is really to help states get ahead of the curve on wildfire threats, to again promote that knowledge transfer that we're seeing, I think, from east to west. Specifically for the objectives for today's call, as I mentioned, we're going to be focused on wildfire legislation and policy. So we're going to hear from Dalton. He's going to share a little bit about some recent wildfire legislation kind of across the states, describe those key policy trends, kind of what's shaping this landscape of energy security and wildfire response. We're also going to touch on a little bit on policy diffusion, again, that east to west legislative trend we're seeing, and kind of the patterns of policy diffusion. And then also recognizing kind of how state energy offices can help advise and work with their legislatures to develop this policy. So with that, I will pause just for a minute, and we're going to go into a bit of an icebreaker open discussion just to get folks thinking. We'll throw a Menti in the chat. If you're unfamiliar with Menti, we'll just be able to pull up on your browser or your cell phone. There's a quick code, and Campbell will share a screen. It's really just to get folks chatting early on. So I'll throw this in the chat. Oh, Campbell beat me to it. Perfect. Through the code. But just two quick questions, really just to level set this conversation, kind of see who's joining us in the virtual Zoom room. All right. We've already got some responses, but feel free to scan that if you are using your iPhone or smartphone. What level of involvement have you had in informing or implementing wildfire-related legislation? Getting some responses on, I track wildfire legislation, but do not have involvement in development or implementation. Got another response for, my office has responsibility for implementing legislation pertaining toward wildfire programs. We'll just give it a minute. Hear from folks in the room. All right, one last call for her. Any more responses? Okay, we'll go on to the next one. I'll just read aloud. From your perspective, where can state and federal legislation be most helpful in wildfire resilience for the energy sector? This one's kind of a fill in the blank, open prompt question, so look forward to hearing your responses. Quiet bunch. Oh, wait, here we go. We got one. I was like, I know Dalton's going to tell us what's going on in the state wildfire landscape, but I'd like to hear from you guys. Addressing limited liability needs. Oh, here they're coming in. People are just thinking. Funding, training, and awareness. Ooh, have a call out for helping legislation to support smaller utilities do risk mapping and assessment. I really like that one. Better understand the risk profile. Yeah, I think we're seeing certainly a need from the small and medium utilities in this space and other space writ large in the energy security space, needing for technical assistance and also funding in that need. We'll maybe give it another minute. See if any other responses come on in. Getting some more responses on utility liability. Yep, seeing how it could impact insurance costs for homeowners funding for these activities. I know most folks know this, but I know there's a sweet spot, especially for state energy offices engaging those small and medium utilities. Funding equipment and training for small fire departments, another good call out, which are mostly volunteer departments. Yeah. Well, appreciate your responses on that. In the interest of time, I think we're going to move on and kick it over to Dalton here in just a second. But before I do that, unfortunately, we had a senator from Senator Sandals from Utah. He wasn't able to join us today, but did want to throw in some resources related to what he was planning on discussing. Hopefully, we can get him on another time. But in regards, it was relevant to the conversation, just in regards to state legislation that's been passed. He was the co-sponsor for a Utah State Wildfire Fund. So just throwing that in the chat that was passed in 2024. Would encourage you to look at that if you're not already familiar. I'm sure Dalton's going to speak a little bit to that. But with that, I will throw it over to Dalton. He joins us from the National Council of State Legislatures and works on their environmental, energy, and transportation team and is a policy associate there. So the floor is yours, Dalton. I know you're going to plan to share some slides.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that introduction. Um, as Sarah said, my name is Dalton Oberfell. I am a policy associate with the National Conference of State Legislatures. Let me share my screen here real quick. Right. Really quickly before I kind of get into it, if anyone is unaware, NCSL works with state legislators kind of in a similar manner to NASEO working with state energy offices. Our membership is primarily state legislators and legislative staff. So just kind of keeping that in mind as we move through these slides. As I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, wildfires are increasing a lot throughout the nation. So too is the legislation that we've seen addressing wildfires. Over the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of increases in legislation that touches on wildfires just in general. We've also seen a lot of legislation touch on wildfires specifically related to energy infrastructure. So in 2023, we saw about 59 bills in 15 states that kind of touched on wildfire in general. 4 of those bills were related to energy infrastructure in just 2 states. By 2025, that has gone up to almost 300 bills in 36 states. And 19 bills related to energy infrastructure in 10 states. A lot of this legislation that we've seen is addressing items I'm sure all of you are going to be very familiar with. We've seen a lot of legislation on wildfire mitigation plans. A lot of that legislation is also going to touch on utility liability, insurance, and different damage assessments. And we've started recently to see more around state funding pools, which is what Utah Senator Sendall would have talked about if he was here. And I did want to also note one thing that has been pretty absent from the legislation that we've been seeing on wildfires is anything that's really significant around public safety power shutoffs. I'll get into it more in a little bit, but states have not really had any type of significant legislation around public safety power shutoffs. So this is just a pretty broad overview of where the legislation has been occurring so far. This darker blue color is states that have enacted legislation around wildfire mitigation plans. The states in yellow are states that introduced legislation in 2026. New Mexico is kind of an interesting case. Their legislative session only is 1 month long, and it just recently ended last week. And I'm sure Puck will speak more to what's going on in New Mexico, but it is an interesting case, I think. And then this last state is Hawaii. They established their wildfire mitigation plans through commission order instead of enacted legislation. This is just a overview of the bill numbers for all of this legislation if you want to go and look at the differences in them. I wanted to highlight this because 6 of these states enacted their legislation last year in 2025. And I think it's really important to highlight how wildfire mitigation plans are kind of picking up pace within states, especially in the West. And this also just kind of highlights the frequency that the covered utilities need to file their wildfire mitigation plans. So you can kind of see some variation within the legislation itself. It's not, as I'll talk about more later with policy diffusion, it's not a kind of plug and play in different states. So this just kind of highlights when these bills have been enacted and some of the variation that we've seen within the bills. This chart I grabbed from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I think it's very helpful to kind of lay out the different types of directives that we've seen in the legislation. Just the types of standards that go into the actual plans that utilities need to account for, whether or not those bills are modifying liability, whether or not they're modifying damages. And then this last one, which I'll talk about in a little bit, the payment fund or bond authorization provides just a kind of state funding pool for utilities in those states. Currently, only 2 states have it, California and Utah. But this chart, I think, is very helpful to kind of lay out, again, those differences that we're seeing. These bills are not being taken exactly as they're written in other states. They're getting very much local context included in them. So I think this chart just really highlights some of those differences, and it's nice to see it state by state, the different kind of priorities within the legislation. In terms of the liability and damage standards, I will throw out, I'm not a lawyer. I cannot get into a very comprehensive conversation on the types of liability structures and what that means for utilities. But I did want to note the types of liability structures that the states have in their wildfire mitigation plans. So in Arizona, California, Idaho, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming, when the utility is in compliance with an approved wildfire mitigation plan, they are determined to have met the standard of care, which is very helpful for that utility in terms of their liability. Montana and North Dakota now use negligence law instead of strict liability. And then Hawaii established a prudent conduct standard for wildfire fund replenishment. Some states have not adjusted their utilities liability in their wildfire mitigation plans. So Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, their wildfire mitigation plan legislation does not establish any liability modification for those utilities. And then in terms of damage limitations, Idaho, Kansas, and Montana will limit the damages against utilities even without an approved wildfire mitigation plan. And then Arizona, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Wyoming limit damages against utilities with an approved wildfire mitigation plan. So one of the more, I would say, newer areas we're seeing states kind of dive into wildfire mitigation is around these state funding pools. And they've been enacted to kind of ensure another backstop for financial security for the utilities operating in their state. California was the first one to enact this type of legislation in 2019 with Assembly Bill 1054. It provides $5 billion in funding for wildfire mitigation for the 3 main utilities operating in the state. And the fund also provides $21 billion in insurance protection. If the energy equipment ignited the wildfire, damages exceed $1 billion. The total damages are not covered by insurance, and the utility company acted reasonably in its conduct. And then just wanted to note that funds are capitalized through ratepayers and shareholders. It's a 50-50 split on that. And the legislation gives 10 years for utilities to gather those funds and 15 years for ratepayers. Utah was the next state to follow suit with House Bill 224. It established the Utah Fire Fund, but basically it allows utilities to collect a fire surcharge from their ratepayers over a period of 10 years. And then the fire fund is supposed to help make settlement agreement payments or economic damage assessments. And again, provides an additional form of financial insurance for these utilities. And then specifically, the bill says that rate increases are capped at 4.95% or $3.70 per month per average residential customer. I did want to note that some states have tried to enact their own type of wildfire fund. Oregon also tried to do this in 2025, but that legislation did not pass. It would have established the catastrophic wildfire fund that would have allowed utilities to collect necessary funds from ratepayers to capitalize the fund, and then claimants would have been able to collect up to 80% of property damage through the fund. I also wanted to highlight a bill that was passed in Texas last year. I think it's pretty unique. I have not seen another state do this. Texas House Bill 145 allows utilities to self-insure all or part of the potential liability or catastrophic property loss that could not have been reasonably anticipated. The bill also specifies that these utilities have to try to get insurance through the market first. If they're unable to do that, then they can self-insure all or part of their infrastructure. Next, going back to public safety power shutoffs. Obviously, the issue is very controversial, I think, right now, especially in the Western United States. We have not really seen state legislators wade into the issue in any type of significant manner. State legislation has not really directed when a utility can do a public safety power shutoff, what types of conditions have to be present for them to do that. The legislation we've seen has really been more targeted around the after effects of a public safety power shutoff, or around the communication on the front end with the public. I wanted to highlight 3 bills in this area. This is not an all-encompassing list, so there's a lot more out there. The first bill I wanted to highlight is California Senate Bill 732. It failed in 2025, but it would have allowed critical facilities, which the bill defined as hospitals or police and fire stations, emergency operation centers, these types of facilities to exceed emission and air contaminant limits with backup generation sources during a public safety power shutoff. Hawaii House Bill 902, which is currently still pending, would appropriate funds to the Department of Education to conduct a study on methods to support department schools that would be impacted during a public safety power shutoff. The studies would include types of backup generation sources, things like air emissions. So really providing funding to conduct studies on the effects of a public safety power shutoff. And then New Mexico House Bill 171, which when I checked about middle of last week, there wasn't a ton of movement on this bill. As I mentioned, New Mexico's legislative session ended last week, so I'm not sure if there was any movement up for this bill at the last part of last week. But the bill would have required the Public Utilities Commission to promulgate a rule setting the standards for monitoring, notice and response protocols, public safety power shutoffs, service infrastructure, and vegetation management. I did want to note in these bills, to me, they seem a little random. And I think that is really the thing I wanted to highlight with public safety power shutoffs. None of these bills are really addressing when a public safety power shutoff should be done, how it should be done. They might set more guidelines around what happens afterwards or communicating with the public beforehand. But as of now, it really seems that state legislatures are leaving the issue to utilities, and especially the experts within the utilities, to make that decision instead of taking it to the state house. So I do think it is important to highlight that public safety power shutoffs, while controversial, do not seem to be an area that states have really gone in after in any type of significant way. And with that, we'll kind of switch over to policy diffusion and a little bit of how this kind of touches on wildfires. So policy diffusion is kind of an academic term. There's a pretty significant academic theory behind policy diffusion. There's not really any central definition of what policy diffusion is. At a very basic level, it is how one government's policy choices are influenced by the choices of other governments. The US system of federalism really lends itself well to policy diffusion in the United States. I mean, we've all heard the cliche, states are the laboratory of democracy. This is really good for policy diffusion. What works well in one state is probably going to attract attention from other states, and they might try to replicate that legislation or address certain local contexts with it. In that kind of area, policy diffusion can occur from the federal government to states. It can occur from states up to the federal government. It can happen state to state. There's also been bills that have international or local influence. And academic scholarship has really helped identify some really broad lessons with policy diffusion that apply to a lot of different types of legislation. So I wanted to highlight one of these articles. These lessons come from Chapon and Bolden in their article, Policy Diffusion, 7 Lessons for Scholars and Practitioners. If you would like to read the full article, I have not been able to find it outside of an academic journal. If you are interested in reading it and have any trouble accessing it, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share access with you. But they point some really key lessons with policy diffusion and how this kind of process occurs. So this first lesson they highlight is that policy diffusion is not merely geographic clustering of similar practices. And I think it's a little ironic to mention that while we're talking about things like wildfire mitigation plans, when the map we saw earlier is basically just the West right now. It can happen geographically, but since we live in an increasingly connected world, access to information is very easy, and that makes policy diffusion able to occur beyond states that border each other or might be in the same region. It could even have an influence beyond the United States. The next 2 lessons are governments compete with each other and governments learn from each other. I think these kind of go hand in hand, and I think they're very intuitive. I think governments competing with each other, the most obvious example is going to be taxes and how states tax a bunch of different items. But governments also learn from each other. What works well in one state, as I said earlier, is probably going to get the attention of other states. And they're likely to try to replicate that in their state. The next lesson they highlight is that policy diffusion is not always beneficial. And in this kind of space, the authors highlight how competition may help remove inefficiencies or eliminate waste and might help in matching services to residents. It could also result in a race to the bottom, and that can be seen through different kind of policy areas. I don't think it's entirely relevant to wildfire mitigation, but I do think it's a good point that the authors make. The next lesson they talk about is that politics and government capabilities are important to diffusion. This one to me seems fairly obvious. The politics of a specific state is obviously going to play a role in how that state chooses its policies. The authors also kind of mentioned the role of lobbyists and different groups in that state and all the interests they have. So politics is obviously going to be a central influence in the types of policies they try to take from other states. This next lesson, policy diffusion, depends on the policies themselves. Again, seems very obvious to me, but the authors note how complex policies spread more slowly, whereas compatible policies spread more quickly. This one, I think, is very relevant to wildfire mitigation. And as I'll talk about in the next slide, wildfire mitigation plans, wildfire legislation tends to be more complex. So it's not entirely surprising that it is not getting picked up by every state right away. The process is going to be a lot slower. And then the final lesson they talk about is that decentralization is crucial for policy diffusion. Again, just highlighting how the federalist system in the United States lends itself very well to different states picking up different items from each other. And then the final slide here, I wanted to talk about how this kind of pertains to wildfires. As I mentioned earlier, current wildfire legislation that we're seeing right now tends to be very complex. There are a multitude of different issues that tend to be interconnected with each other that states have to address in their local context. It probably would not make sense for South Dakota to adopt California's legislation, or vice versa. So there's a lot of different factors in these that are all connected with each other that states have to think about. And just some of these questions that states are going to have to think about is, does compliance with an approved wildfire mitigation plan lessen liability for that utility? States may have different standards that they want included in their wildfire mitigation plan, or this might be the most standardized part of the legislation that we're seeing. Does the state want to include tort reform in their legislation? It can be a very controversial issue. Does the state want to include that specifically for wildfire mitigation? The state's going to have to look at how are these costs going to be recovered, and especially for utilities that are operating in multiple states, how is that going to affect them in that state? How might it affect them in other states? And someone had mentioned earlier working with smaller utilities or electric cooperatives. Again, thinking about that in the terms of wildfire mitigation, how is that going to affect utilities that have less resources, less staff, to either comply with these types of legislation or bills, or are they getting more funding to comply with them? All of those different issues go into that. And then this kind of final question, at least I was thinking about, are how can states ensure continued financial solvency of utilities given more frequent and extreme wildfires? I myself do not have questions or answers for any of these questions. I think that they are very complex. I do think that state energy offices could have a role in helping state legislators answer these types of questions. I think you all provide unique expertise that state legislators may not have themselves. So I do think this is one area that state energy offices and state legislators can really work together. But I think as wildfires just become more frequent across the nation in general, we're going to see a lot of these types of legislation continue to move from the western states out towards the east. How quickly that happens, I don't think I can say. I think significant events or significant fires might provide some catalyst for states if that happens in their area. But I do think we will continue to see this type of legislation move towards the east. With that, I think I've taken up my time. All of my information is here. I believe Sarah will be distributing these slides as well. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. Or if you need any more information, please feel free to reach out to me as well.
We'll appreciate the time. We will transition over now to Puck Stare, who is the director of the Energy Conservation and Management Division within New Mexico's Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. I know Dalton alluded to it, but it sounds like you've had a very busy last couple months in regards to legislative season. So I know you're going to touch a bit on that and kind of the work that's going on in there. So I will pass it over to you. And I believe you're going to share some slides for us.
I am. And thanks all, and thanks for being here. Before I jump in, I just want to get a sense of who I'm talking to. Can you use like the Zoom feature to raise your hand if you're with a state east of the Mississippi? So if you're east of the Mississippi, hit your little, like, I don't know, raise your hand function. Only one east of the two. Okay. 3. Skier. I'm sorry, you're a skier east of the Mississippi. Okay. Connecticut. Okay, thanks. All right, now the opposite. So if you are representing a state west of the Mississippi, can you raise your hand function, or otherwise put it in the chat or something? West of the Mississippi. Okay. Hi, my Western friends. Okay. Thank you for that. That's just helpful to know the room. So like Sarah said, my name is Puck Stare, and I'm the director of the New Mexico Energy Office. And I'm going to tell you a story today about what New Mexico has done as a case study. I'm thinking of it as like what I did last summer, because that's what we did. So as many of you know, out here in the West, we're drying fast. It's very sad. In New Mexico, I think of all 50 states, we're drying the fastest. And we've had not one, but two major fires. We had the Caps Canyon and Hermit's Peak fire a couple years ago, and then last summer we had the Ruidoso and Salt fires, and all of them have these long names because they're actually multiple fires that grew and merged together. So that just gives you a sense of there's just a lot of little fires happening every day, and sometimes they get out of control. So I'm going to share screen. So what our legislature did was pass a piece of legislation. Let's make sure we can all see this. You can see? Yes? Okay. A piece of legislation called Senate Memorial 2, which basically directed a wide group of us to get into a room together and lock the door and figure some things out. It's the short answer. So, and we were the boss of it at MNERD. And the official directive were to, as you see here on the screen, develop and recommend a statewide strategy to avoid and mitigate wildfires, to advise the interim legislative committee on the funding needs and the potential legislation, and to identify best practices, policies, and investments with an emphasis on vegetation management. And then at the end of all that, deliver a report with an unbiased summary of stakeholder discussions, highlighting the areas of consensus and the areas of divergence. So we locked ourselves in a room. This is who was in the room. And I just want you to see it's a large, diverse number of folk. I'm not going to, yes, you'll get these slides and so you get all the detail, but on the left-hand side is a bunch of state agencies, 10 different state agencies. The turquoise is utilities, co-ops, IOUs, everything in between. We had trial attorneys, insurers, trial attorneys, and wildfire data experts. And we essentially locked ourselves in a room together. And what the first thing we did is figure out, of all those entities, everyone's going to be holding a different piece of the pie. And so we started mapping everybody's interests. So here you see insurers, they're interested in protecting homeowners. The IOUs want to provide electricity with profit and be solvent after a wildfire. I'm not going to go through all of this because you'll get these slides. Trial lawyers want to defend property owners and make sure that utilities and insurers are accountable. Public interest, obviously reliable electricity, being safe at home, having affordable insurance. Rural electric co-ops had different needs, and so on. So we kind of mapped all this out. And then what we've decided to focus on was what we call the zone of agreement, where all of our, we've all different perspectives, but we definitely agreed on these things in the middle. We agreed mitigation through vegetation management and grid hardening, prevention, prohibit punitive damages. Actually, we agreed on that, and limiting damages for co-ops. But to back up a second, we first wanted to start with data, and we had this question of like, what actually is causing wildfire in New Mexico? And here's the data that we currently have. And if you'll see what's really interesting, I told you we got a lot of fires. So 700 fires, 685, 614. So we average around high 600, low 700 fires per year. The number of fires where the cause is undetermined or unknown is actually pretty high. It's like a third of them here, 269, 244, 149, 43, as you can see. The ones where we know, that the cause is lightning for sure is maybe a sixth or a seventh. Where the cause is utilities is actually, as we know, of vanishingly small. And then interestingly, railroad or buildings. And the last column, my favorite, is spontaneous combustion. And so we had two takeaways from this. One is, actually, everyone thinks, all these wildfires are caused by utilities. That's actually not true. And the major causes is lightning. And actually, the most major cause is unknown. So that immediately flagged for us, wait, we are kind of operating in a data vacuum. And maybe one of the first things we want to concentrate is, how did these fires actually get started in the first place? Fully a third of them, nobody knows. So that was one major takeaway for us in guiding principle. The other was, I want to point out this UC Berkeley study on kind of cost and benefit. And again, you'll get the slides, you can read all the details, but really what I want you to notice is on the bar on the left, fast trip costs the least in terms of preventing, and all the way on the right-hand side, vegetation management costs the most. And in between is PSPSs and undergrounding, essentially. So, maybe fast tripping and kind of grid modernization is actually more effective than vegetation management. So these are kind of two data points that started steering the conversation among us. Then we next outline like existing efforts that we can continue without legislative action. And I'm not going to go through the whole list because it actually turned out to be a lot of things that we are already doing that we can continue doing, from mapping the wildfire risk to mapping the fuels treatment to home hardening programs. There's quite a lot going on in the state, and we wanted to flag that and say, these are good, keep funding them, keep going. We don't have to change anything. We don't have to pass a law. We don't have to set up a fund. We can just keep going with these efforts. And then we plunged into, okay, well, what's not being done that needs to be done? And we converged on these 4 focus areas. So I'm going to spend a minute on this slide because this one's important. And we divided ourselves into 4 working groups with focus areas because we realized there was way too much work to get done if we all did it, 50 people in a room at the time. So the first was pre-season engagement. We realized that there were a lot of people doing good things about fires, but we weren't coordinating. So we decided to really focus in on early season coordination each year, stakeholder communication, and preparedness planning. In other words, the left hand and the right hand didn't always know what was going on. So the utilities would announce a PSPS, but our emergency office wasn't prepared or wasn't notified. So there's really simple things we could do to coordinate. The second thing is data governance and sharing. Going back to my first slide about kind of flying blind in terms of data, is that we realized we needed to take what data we have and put it all together in one place and start to figure out why fires get started, what are riskier conditions, what are less risky conditions, what kind of home hardening works, what kind of home hardening doesn't work, all of that stuff. So we wanted to focus on barriers to data access, interagency data coordination, and wildfire data standards. The third we realized is grid modernization, which is the best fire is one that never starts, right? So what can we do with our existing grid to keep the lights on and to prevent wildfire from even starting in the first place? So infrastructure vulnerabilities and opportunities, service continuity, and utility risk mitigation. And then only at the very end do we get to the thing that people actually think about first, which is liability and negligence, legal exposure, insurance coverage, compensation frameworks. And we quickly realized of these 4, we have a lot of consensus on the first 3. Pretty much everyone in the room agreed we need to do these 3 things, and we kind of had a lot of agreement on what to do. Obviously, with the 4th one, there's no consensus, but we realized that's a kind of okay, because if we worked really hard on the first 3, we would reduce the number of fires in the first place and never get to kind of the blame game afterwards, which nobody wants to be in that position. So as a group, we agreed to really put our time and money and efforts into 1, 2, and 3, and then simply report to the legislature our difference of opinion on the liability and negligence. And that actually was the best that we could do for New Mexico in terms of actually preventing damage. So these next 20 slides, and again, I'm going to go really fast and let you give them to you later, take you through each of these consensus recommendations in pretty intensive detail if you want to copy paste or borrow from our strategy. But for the consensus, as you saw, 1, pre-season engagement. 2, we divided into 2 categories, categorizing the data needs, clarifying data ownership. 3 had a bunch of subcategories with grid modernization. I won't walk through them. And then 4 was we divided into 2 different categories. And again, I'm not going to go through, well, I'll stop by a couple of them, but for example, for pre-season engagement, we recognized, gosh, we don't even do a pre-game huddle with all of the relevant agencies who do respond to wildfire ahead of the season. We do now. It's actually happening next week in early February to prepare for the season. So that means the utilities, the co-ops, the emergency management, the local fire folk, the communications folk, the broadband people, we're all getting together into a room and kind of pre-gaming, as you pointed out, Sarah, okay, what's the situation with the snowpack in New Mexico? What's the forecast for different regions? Where do we think if a disastrous fire is going to pop up this season, where might it be? What are the heaviest areas of risk, and et cetera. So that's already happening. We put that in place immediately. Number 2, categorizing data. We recognize actually that during wildfire, the utilities in some ways are disincentivized from sharing data because of liability and IPRA and also security concerns, because it all effectively becomes a state record, and then anyone can IPRA that information, or sorry, FOA, you might call it in your state. And we recognize we need to put in data protections so that before, during, and after emergency, we can all share information with each other and protect the information that needs to be kept secure for whatever, grid security reason, or high technology reason, something like that. So that may take a tweak to the law. We think it doesn't, and our lawyers are kind of looking into that. There's an existing emergency clause in the law that we think we can use. So that's something to think about. And then, like I said, I'm not going to go through there's pages and pages, as you can see, of really concrete actions that we recommended. I will just point out landowner access and responsibility was really interesting. We all know that utilities have their right-of-way, which they do clear and they're responsible for, and that's part of their vegetation management plan. But what's been happening in New Mexico involves vegetation sometimes outside the right-of-way. For example, we had a very tall tree outside the right-of-way, but it was so tall that when it fell into the right-of-way and caused an ignition there. And another example was blowing vegetation. So yeah, we're famous for tumbleweeds and we have a lot of high winds, and there is loose vegetation at times that can blow from outside the right-of-way into the right-of-way. So even if the utility has faithfully followed its vegetation management plan, but let's say they spot that tall tree in a neighbor's ranch and want permission to go trim that tree to protect that property and all the other properties, what happens then? And that takes on a particularly interesting twist in New Mexico with all of our tribal land as well, which can be involved. So we've got a little work to do to suss out how does a utility properly get permission or request and then get permission to do the kind of vegetation mitigation that would make us all safer, while also respecting property rights. And in the cases of our tribes, also respecting like culturally sensitive areas, and tribal sovereignty. So that was something that we didn't, any of us see coming until we all got in the room and we heard some stories from the utilities. We had a tribal liaison there, we had private property folks there, and we realized like this needs a little bit of work in the law somehow to clarify, what happens if a landowner with that tall tree refuses access to the utility and then that tree ignites the fire. Like who's responsible at that point? So we're not quite done there, but that was an interesting learning lesson for all of us. And I will say, could not have happened unless we all were in that room together during the summer. Okay, and then non-consensus recommendations. All we did here was just simply summarize the different points of view of all the different folk and hand it off to the legislature, because that's what the legislature does, is balance competing interests. But we really stress that if we can work on number 1, 2, and 3, we hope to reduce fires in the first place and never really get to section 4. And I think, so part of that was also we've mentioned here, the Wildfire Compensation Fund, which again, it's very complicated. We did not finish our work here. We recognize that there may need to be a fund. And in fact, Colton mentioned that there was some legislation. This piece of legislation did get drafted in the last session that just ended on Thursday. It did not get passed, but there was an attempt to design and start a fund for both prevention and also for compensation. It didn't get that far, but in New Mexico, as you heard, our legislative sessions are either 30 days or 60 days. So it's very common for legislation to take 2 or 3 years to get to the finish line. So just because it didn't pass, I don't know if that means it's dead or if it will have a second attempt next session in January. We'll find out. And Colton, on the HB 171, the actual another bill for the wildfire fund, that one didn't move at all. Take that for what you will. And I'll just leave you in closing, just that what we really found a useful way to spend our time was in really thinking about prevention and coordination and data sharing, and also grid modernization, fast tripping, all of those things. We realized that that was just a much more productive use of our time than battling over and over again after fire liability. Like our goal was to prevent the fires in the first place and never even get to that conversation. So with that, I will stand for questions, but I do want to call out that this was very much a group effort. These were the leads of various sections of the group, but there were literally 50 to at times 60 people in the room. And I will say that is only possible through kind of the special convening power that a state energy office has, that we are not exactly a neutral party, but our primary goal is in looking out for the best interests of the whole state. And we interface with all of the different stakeholders, from data companies to grid modernization folk to IOUs to tort lawyers, that we have a unique role and a unique voice as a state energy office, and that we are kind of trusted by all of those folk, and we can understand their point of view enough that they're willing to come to the table and express the point of view. And the absolute takeaway for all of us involved in this wildfire study group was, wow, this is really effective. And we immediately our first recommendation to the legislature had nothing to do with fire at all, but simply said, this structure works. And we think you should do this again with other really gnarly issues that are bothering us in the state, like water use or immigration or gun control, or other really difficult issues. It's basically force us to lock ourselves in a room together over the summer, and you might get some really productive ideas out of it. So I will end there. Very much welcome questions, and I'm happy to talk also offline with any of you if you want to figure out how to replicate this in your states. So thank you.